The desert was too quiet for morning. A stone desert like this one should have cracked with heat the moment the sun rose, warming the rocks, blurring the air with shimmering waves. But now the sun had climbed high enough to sharpen distant ridges, and yet the heat haze never thinned. It hung over the land like a soft veil, wavering, trembling, refusing to lift even as the wind picked up across the flat expanse. An Oryx named Karoo walked slowly across the plateau, his hooves knocking loose pebbles from the ancient bedrock. His pale coat, built for desert glare, should have blended into the hard light. Instead, it looked washed out, nearly swallowed by the constant shimmer in the air. He stopped and raised his head. The horizon trembled. Not from distance, not from heat alone, but from something persistent, something holding the land hostage under a layer of distortion that would not fade. Karoo blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the wavering curtain ahead of him remained. The same dune appeared twice. The same ridge stretched in two directions. A lonely acacia tree at the base of a small hill flickered as if it existed in two states at once, solid and ghost-like. He stepped forward. The Mirage moved with him, not retreating, as mirages always did, not changing shape, just sliding sideways, like a sheet of glass shifting lightly to the touch. Karoo felt a twist of unease pull beneath his ribs. Deserts shifted temperature quickly, rocks cooled at night and heated by noon. Air rose, fell, changed density. Mirages came and went with that rhythm. But this mirage ignored all rhythm. It clung to the ground. It held its shape. It was wrong. He tilted his head and listened. Nothing. No chirping lizards. No dry clicks of beetles. No distant rasp of wind crossing the stones. Only the constant low hum of heat trapped where it shouldn't be. Karoo moved again. The shimmer intensified. Light bent along the edges of rocks, turning their shadows sharp and twisted. A ridge in the distance curved subtly, bending downward as though softened by glass. Even the sky seemed to ripple near the horizon, warping the clean blue into thin streaks. He snorted softly, tasting dust in the air. It was hotter than it should have been. Not scorching, he had lived through worse, but stale. The heat felt trapped inside the desert, refusing to cycle upward. Karoo lifted his head higher, scanning for movement. A jeep appeared on the far slope, flickering, wavering. He blinked again. The jeep stabilized into view. Humans. They had been moving through the region for weeks, scientists studying the rock layers, water tables, strange mineral patterns. Karoo had seen them many times. They usually left quickly, as harsh terrain never allowed long visits. But recently they'd stayed, and the Mirage had appeared. Karoo edged downward toward a narrow canyon where shade softened the glare. The canyon normally offered relief. Today the air inside it shimmered just as heavily as the surface plateau. Shadows pooled at odd angles. Rock edges blurred. Loose stones seemed to float for a heartbeat before settling again. He stepped between the walls cautiously. Heat radiated not from above, but from the stone itself. He pressed a hoof to the ground. Warm. Too warm for early morning. The stone looked dry, but faint moisture glistened near a crack, evaporating instantly. Karoo lowered his head and breathed deeply. The air tasted metallic, mineral-rich, heavy. He turned toward a narrow bend and froze. The canyon ahead split into two identical paths, perfect mirror twins that shimmered and overlapped. One was real, one was the Mirage, but the Mirage did not blur or distort like usual. It duplicated the canyon with impossible clarity. Karoo backed out slowly. He returned to the open desert and headed toward a smoother rise in the land. The Mirage followed him, sliding effortlessly over stones and ridges. When he reached higher ground, he saw the strange effect had expanded across several kilometers. The desert looked as if someone had overlaid another desert on top of it, slightly offset, two realities separated by a swollen sheet of heated air. Karoo climbed to the ridge. Below him, the humans stood near their jeep, setting up shimmering metal devices on tripods. They aimed sensors at the horizon. One checked a heat camera. Another unfolded a portable weather station that whirred and clicked. Their voices carried only faintly. Thermal inversions still not breaking. Heat's trapped at ground level. Mirage is stable for over 9 hours. Never seen that. Surface temps rising without wind. Dangerous. Karoo listened. Instinct told him something deeper was wrong. Not the heat, not the mirage, the land. He stepped forward and felt a soft tremor run through the rock. Very faint, barely perceptible, but real. The desert floor quivered under him like a stretched surface adjusting to pressure beneath. Then the mirage shifted again, but not in the air, on the ground. A long ripple of distortion passed across the plateau, bending light in one smooth wave. Rocks elongated briefly, shadows stretched sideways, and the humans stumbled as the ground visually twisted beneath their feet. Karoo staggered, caught off guard. When the ripple finished, the desert looked normal again. But the heat stayed, the shimmer stayed, the mirage stayed. He watched as one human knelt and tapped a reading on a sensor. Another shouted something urgent. Subsurface temperature spike. Heat coming from below. Not atmosphere. Not sunlight. Ground layer is releasing thermal pockets. Karoo didn't know their words, but he understood tone. Fear. He stepped backward as another tremor passed. This one stronger, enough to rattle loose stones. The air thickened again, and the mirage layered itself sharper than before. 2 ridges, 2 trees, 2 identical dust plumes behind a distant dune. The desert was copying itself. Not magic, not mystery. Heat. Heat trapped beneath the stone layers, rising through mineral pockets, bending the air, holding the mirage in place like a permanent bruise upon the landscape. Karoo exhaled sharply. He had to move. Other animals would flee with him. The desert was shifting in a way no creature could ignore. He turned toward the far plains, one last glance at the shimmering ridge. The mirage didn't fade. It followed him. The desert had lost its breath, and the land beneath his hooves had begun to warm from the inside. Karoo descended from the ridge slowly, hooves scraping over fractured stone. Every step sent a dull vibration up his legs, as if the desert floor was hollowing beneath the surface. The mirage rippled horizontally, sliding across the landscape like a shifting sheet of molten glass. He paused often, trying to decide whether the rocks ahead were real or reflections stretched into false positions. Wind finally brushed his coat, but instead of cooling him, it carried more heat, thick, unmoving, trapped near the ground like a lid pressed on a pot. He exhaled through his nostrils, tasting grit and minerals. The desert's scent had changed. Usually dry and sharp, it now felt thick and heavy, like the mouth of a cave filled with stale air. He continued down a shallow slope toward a small oasis, one he had visited many times. The waterhole usually shimmered lightly in the morning sun. Now it glowed too brightly, the reflections smeared across the surface in strange, elongated shapes. Karoo approached cautiously. The oasis looked wrong. The water didn't move, not a ripple, not a breath of wind disturbing it. It sat like polished stone, its surface too smooth. He stepped closer. The mirage clinging above the water refused to break, even though shade from the nearby acacia tree should have cooled the air. Instead, the shade bent around an invisible heat pocket. The tree's shadows split into 2 identical silhouettes, one lying correctly on the sand, the other distorted upward along the shimmering air. Karoo leaned forward and sniffed the water. Warm. Unnaturally warm. Oasis water never stayed warm past sunrise, especially in winter season. But this water carried heat trapped from the ground, not the sun. He backed away. A lizard lay motionless near the edge, chest rising weakly. It tried to crawl, but its legs trembled. Karoo watched it flick its tongue out once, slow, exhausted, before it went still again. Another tremor rolled through the desert, this one stronger. Sand grains danced, small stones rattled. A thin crack appeared near the base of the acacia tree. Karoo stiffened, muscles coiling. He looked toward the horizon. Dust rose in a strange, smooth column, not swirling as dust devils normally did, but lifting uniformly as though drawn upward by a great heat source beneath. The Mirage bent the column into two separate plumes, one vertical, one leaning sideways. Karoo jerked his head left. Movement. Two gazelles ran across the plain, veering sharply away from the oasis. They staggered as though drunk, legs misjudging distance. One leapt over a rock only to land short, hooves skidding on unseen pebbles the Mirage had hidden. Their shadows dragged behind them strangely, one attached properly to their bodies, the second lagging or bending off to the side. They fled in panic. Karoo knew why. Predators were not hunting, nothing stalked them. But the desert itself felt wrong enough to drive prey into flight. He turned again toward the humans. They were further down the slope now, several vehicles parked in a loose circle. Long cables ran from the jeeps to metallic boxes on the ground. A tall mast bristling with sensors stood tilted at an odd angle, heat rippling around it. Humans in wide-brim hats and reflective scarves worked frantically. Karoo froze. Their shadows bent too. A man shouted into a radio, "Ground temperature spike at Point Delta. Thermal inversion locked in place. We need to deploy more reflectance panels. Subsurface chamber heating the stone from below." Karoo didn't understand their language, but tone mattered. Urgency, fear, confusion that bordered on disbelief. One human knelt with a thermal camera, then recoiled. The screen glowed white at the lower edge, too hot to be normal rock heat. She shouted something at the others, pointing at the ground. Another man hammered a metal pole into the stone. Steam hissed around it. He jumped back as if burned. Karoo's nostrils flared. The air shimmered stronger. The mirage thickened again, flattening the horizon until distant mountains looked like floating islands suspended above a white strip of trembling sky. The acacia tree behind him split into 3 wavering duplicates stacked vertically. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the world, but the mirage refused to fade. A pulse of hot air rose from the earth. Not wind, not convection. A deep, breath-like exhalation. The sand cracked. A cluster of rocks shifted. The ground beneath Karoo's hooves felt like it expanded slightly, then contracted. He turned sharply, head raised, ears alert. The desert was breathing in slow, heavy pulses. All around him, animals reacted. A jackal trotted by hurriedly, tongue hanging out, not hunting, escaping. A group of ostriches raced across the slope, their heads low, legs carrying them in erratic strides as they ran from the mirage-heavy zone. A tortoise pushed itself away from a shaded rock as if even its shell couldn't protect it from rising heat below. Karoo stepped back and felt something unusual. Coolness. Just a hint of it. He looked down. A crack in the stone released a faint gust of cooler subterranean air. But as it met the desert warmth above, the crack distorted into 2 mismatched lines, and the cool air was swallowed instantly by the thermal layer clinging to the surface. No cooling reached the surrounding ground. The desert was sealed. Heat from beneath rose upward but had nowhere to go. Wind above was blocked by the heavy inversion layer. The two pushed against each other, trapping hot pockets at the ground level. Karoo trotted uphill again, not running yet, but close. Humans shouted again. Heat dome forming. Optical distortion off the charts. Surface cannot cool. Geothermal pressure shifting the stone. A woman pointed at a map, yelling, "The Mirage Zone is expanding. Twice the size in 20 minutes. Karoo looked around. The Mirage Zone now stretched across the entire lower plateau, swallowing rocks, plants, and dunes. Objects blurred, then sharpened in wrong shapes. Duplicates appeared next to originals. Shadows moved independently for seconds before catching up. Karoo took another step. The horizon split again. Once, twice. 3 layers of shimmering desert stacked on top of each other. A headache throbbed behind his eyes. He lowered his head, trying to find solid land beneath shifting air. Then came the largest tremor yet. The ground lurched slightly, stone groaned, loose gravel skittered downhill, the humans staggered, one fell to her knees, the sensor mast toppled sideways, Karoo's heart hammered. He sprinted several meters up the ridge. The desert behind him changed shape. The Mirage bent, collapsed inward, then rebounded outward like a ripple in hot sand. Heat burst from the ground in another wave. The air shimmered until he could not see his own hooves clearly. The stone desert had begun to warp, not visually, but physically, under pressure from a rising thermal pocket beneath the surface. Karoo stood still on a higher ledge, watching the impossible scene unfold below. The Mirage wasn't fading because the desert wasn't cooling, and the desert wasn't cooling because heat was rising, from beneath the stone, from chambers long sealed, from pressure that had finally found a way out. And until that pressure released, the Mirage would hold the desert hostage, and every creature in it.